Hi everyone, and welcome to the Oxford Policy Podcast. My name is Marc Naro, and together with my colleague Diego Peñaranda, we are delighted to host Dr. Mulyani Indrawati, one of the most influential figures in global economic governance. Mulyani holds a PhD in economics and has spent her career at the very heart of international finance. She is the Republic of Indonesia's longest-serving finance minister, leading Indonesia's economy through major crises such as the global financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, all while restoring fiscal discipline, sustaining growth, and reducing poverty. Internationally, Dr. Mulyani also held senior leadership roles as Managing Director and Chief Operating Officer at the World Bank and as an Executive Director at the IMF. She also played a central role in advancing global cooperation to the G20 and the ASEAN. Today, she is joining us from the Blavatnik School of Government, where she is a World Leader Fellow. Mulyani, thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Marc and Diego.
My first question will be about Indonesia's economy, which is often described as a development success story. It now ranks as the 7th largest economy by purchasing power parity. Looking ahead to the next decade, what do you see as the most difficult political and economical challenge for Indonesia?
Well, Indonesia is middle upper income country. As a big country with 265 million population, geographically we also quite large. This is an archipelago country in which natural resources quite quite a lot for Indonesia. We also have a huge forest and of course the sea line. So for Indonesia, actually, the question regarding to continue progressing and have a higher income growth and at the same time also addressing the issue of poverty and equality is very, very important. I think in the past decade, Indonesian economy was built based on the foundation of both macro stability, in which the macro policy like fiscal, monetary policy has been designed in a way that can provide a strong foundation for growth, inflation low enough, exchange rate relatively stable so that it will allow the economy to grow well. At the same time, as the structural issue, there are a lot of effort has been addressed in order to improve the competitiveness and the productivity of Indonesia. Whether this is on the human capital, investment in education has been mandated by our constitution to be 20% of our budget. Health is becoming also very important because Indonesia have a young demography. So we are still mostly the young cohort of the demography that allow Indonesia to grow relatively strong. And at the same time, we built infrastructure, we reforming Ministry of Finance, reforming financial sector, and also other institutions like competition policy in Indonesia. These are all being designed so that Indonesia can unleash a lot of force of growth, not only dominated by the public, by the government, but also the private sector participation. You asked about the 10 years ahead, the challenge. I think the journey of development for all countries currently, especially under the geopolitical situation, first we have to make sure that we are going to be able to continue withstand the shock which is coming from outside. Like at that time we have pandemic, we also have the global financial crisis. So the ability to withstand external shock. Now we are talking about climate change and digital technology, AI. These are all is going to continue creating a very dynamic both opportunity, but it could be also creating a threat of setback. So Indonesia need to continue invest in human capital because I think that's going to be creating huge advantage in terms of productivity and competitiveness. We have to continue also invest in infrastructure, especially on the connectivity, as well as access to energy, because with the digital technology, AI, these are going to depend on energy, access of energy for the people. And then we also have to continue strengthen institution, both public institution and private institution. Public institution is like judicial system in Indonesia, tax system in Indonesia. And that's why reform in the Ministry of Finance is very, very important. We also need to continue making sure that investment climate is going to be strong, reliable, and credible, because that will create confidence on investment.
Thank you very much. Now I wanted to turn a bit to the topic of the G20, which Indonesia led during a very intense moment a few years ago. Looking back, I wanted to ask, what were the main difficulties of this group, and on a more personal note, how was your experience, and what did you have difficulty during that whole process?
Well, the current environment globally, the spirit of cooperation and collaboration is actually a bit under pressure. And that's why a lot of discussion regarding, are we going to have or abandon the rule-based system globally, which has been known by all countries in the world in the past like 4 decades. And now we have to deal with this kind of uncertainty. Now, G20 is actually the forum which is created, if I remember correctly in this case, is actually after the ASEAN financial crisis, which is followed by many emerging country crises, like at that time in 1997 or early 2000. And this is the cooperation among what we call it systematically deep, important country. That's why the size of the economy is very important. The whole region globally. And that was the forum which is created to actually, what did we miss? Why at that time we cannot detect earlier crisis in Asia or even in an emerging country? So that's become like a global crisis. So this is the forum which is focusing mainly initially for the finance as well as a central bank governor, finance minister, and central bank governor. And then after global financial crisis, it become or elevated to become the leaders level. So the summit at the president or prime minister level, because of the devastating impact of this global financial crisis. So Indonesia hold the presidency in 2022. At that time was actually, it went relatively well initially, until then there is a Ukraine war that creating a fragmentation within the G20. So for Indonesia, it was a very difficult presidency, because at the same time we want to make sure that the G20 is continue to be a collective group of country who have a good intention, good willing to actually discuss regarding what policy matters globally that will allow all country in the world to prosper. But at the same time, with the war, the real war, then it affect the relationship, the trust, as well as the confidence among the member country. So Indonesia was able to continue unite the G20, although, and we even at the end of the year during the summit were able to issue communique. This is just to show that even under a very difficult, fragmented, or even what you call it, opposition to each other, the ability, then the leadership of Indonesia to continue create this unity is very, very important. My personal experience during those very difficult time is actually I tried to discuss with many of my colleague minister of finance, especially from the G7, which is very strong at that time against Russia, and then bridging with the China especially, and then India, Brazil. These are all the emerging country who's actually very important, and India as the following year presidency also helping us in terms of making sure that this spirit of cooperation is there. And this communication, both officially, but most importantly, personally, because I've been serving Minister of Finance for quite some time. So I know many of those ministers, central bank governor personally. So that kind of relationship and engagement, which is really trying to continue making sure that cooperation between country and as a group is going to be good for all. And that's really something which I think Indonesia achieved relatively well, in terms of substance, a lot of achievement in this case during those G20, because we also hit by the COVID, remember? So we have the pandemic fund. This is the global effort in order for us to be able to uh, mobilize resources so that the world is going to be prepared for the next possible pandemic. We also announcing just energy transition partnership. This is also something which is very important for not only Indonesia but also for many emerging countries. South Africa participated, some of the ASEAN country also, which is supported by the G7, China and others.
Okay, you mentioned very fragmented world at this time, but right now with the Donald Trump presidency, we feel even more fragmentation and weakening of the multilateral order. So I want you to ask you, the Republic of Indonesia negotiated when you were Minister of Finance a 19% tariff arrangement with the US. But in November, you rejected what is called poison clauses that Donald Trump tried to impose on Indonesia. What lessons do you take from this major shift in international trade policy that we've seen very recently? And how should middle-income economies and regional bodies like Asians should navigate these new rules of the game that you mentioned?
Right. I think we are all, in this case, has been familiar with the rule-based system previously, which is support. In this case, it will be coordinated and led by WTO if we are talking about the trade and investment agreement. And of course, it was not perfect. There are so many issues which just need to be fixed within the context of the multilateral cooperation on a trade and investment. But that was the rule base we just agreed. And with the imposition of tariff by United States in this case, unilaterally, it's actually changed the whole rule-based system. Many countries have to decide whether you are going to deal directly bilaterally, which is this is what the United States want, or collectively, which is the United States is not entertaining that, at least until today. So for each country, they don't have any other choice, but then have to negotiate bilaterally with United States. I think each of the country will look at each other, what they've already asked and what they can get from this negotiation. For particularly Indonesia, they actually have a long list of what you call it non-tariff barrier that they are actually asking Indonesia to address. On that particular concern, this is aligned well with the Indonesia own reform. So we want to reform many of what you call it doing business, trade and investment, because the non-tariff barrier directly or indirectly is actually affecting the competitiveness of our economy, especially the ability to attract capital as well as to establish competitive company in Indonesia. So that is actually relatively very aligned with government-owned or Indonesia-owned reform agenda. On the tariff itself, I think through the negotiation, of course, Indonesia also have commodity which the United States need, but at the same time, Indonesia also have demand for a certain commodity. We are importing wheat. We also have the soybean, as well as I think oil and gas is going to be quite competitive with many of the middle, but also like airplane. So these are all the area that we want to use the opportunity to negotiate, not really framing within the context of the tariff as a prohibiting relationship, but more strengthening the relationship that will mutually benefiting both sides. And as ASEAN, I think we are all, as an ASEAN country, we also look at the other. There are some country which is quite sensitive because they exporting many of the merchandise coming from China or manufacturing in a border of China like Vietnam. So they are getting a different treatment from United States. But each of these ASEAN country agree that actually as a group, ASEAN have a much more opportunity to actually play a constructive role within both regional as well as the global economy.
So with this group dynamic that you're describing, then would you say that the tariffs might not be as important as the non-tariff barriers, or how would
No,
you how would you
well,
rank
tariff
rank
is still,
them
I
both?
mean, but because United States applying globally, so it's not putting one country disadvantage to other. It's like they become additional burden for the economy globally for each country which is imposed by that tariff, or if they are also retaliate, then it will also impacting the United States. United States is also, of course, having the merchandise imported but now subject to tariff, the price is going to be also increased domestically. So it is definitely is not the optimal option at this current moment, but each country, I think, try to be realistic and then try to play within this non-rule based system or regime in this case. Yeah.
Well, and another phenomenon is the fact that multilateral institutions are less and less credible, or they are facing less political support. So, from your perspective, how does this crisis of multilateral financing and credibility is changing the development outlook for the next years, and how should these institutions, such as the World Bank that you worked for, or the UN, should evolve to remain effective and credible?
Well, as much as maybe the spirit today that country, especially the superpower, can unilaterally or doing or preferring to have bilateral relationship rather than using the multilateral institution. But we have to admit that globally, a lot of problem is actually cannot be fixed with bilateral or unilateral power. I mean, you talk about climate change, you talk about digital technology, you are talking about peace and security. These are all what you call it an issue, or even demography within immigration or migration. These are all the issue which cannot be fixed by only one country alone. And that's why I think, like it or not, cooperation among country, whether through this existing multilateral, which is actually designed post World War II in order for the world to be able to actually first maintaining peace, stability, and then creating an environment for all countries to actually make a progress to achieve prosperity, reducing poverty, addressing issue of inequality. I think that kind of spirit and the role of multilateralism, whether this is the UN, World Bank, or IMF and other, is still going to be very important. Like it or not, whether you're not getting the support, but you will be actually forced by the reality that you actually still need that kind of institution. And that's exactly reflecting in all the shareholder. I mean, even the United States with their some of the unilateral action, they still use this institution like the IMF, World Bank, in order for them to be able to push a certain um, agenda. So I think for us, uh, the IMF World Bank, more than 100, I think 162 countries member. This is almost all the world. This is the institution that should strengthen the governance so that they are going to be able to create more confidence and trust. They have to be able to address the issue of global challenge like climate change, like the fragile state, poverty, job, which is now becoming threatening by the AI. I think these are all the area that institution like multilateral institution need to strengthen, and then financially they really need to be continue strong, because many countries, especially emerging and developing countries, they are not in good situation. They are fiscally quite narrow or very limited. Many of them is even have a very high debt exposure. They cannot address their own development issues. They need a lot of support. So I think this is the homework which is still very, very important for this multilateral institution.
Yes, and as a follow-up, I just want to ask you, because one of the biggest example of alternatives that is emerging to this multilateral order is, for instance, the Board of Peace that Donald Trump just mentioned. There are other alternatives that are trying to compete with the current multilateral order. So do you have views on this recent
Well,
evolution?
the response, which is actually you call it alternative or initiative, if you can call it. If you're talking about development finance, there is an AIIB, which is sponsored by the China ASEAN Infrastructure Investment Bank, which actually also tried to get the membership of all the country. But I think regional development bank like ADB, Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, African Development Bank, these are all the initiative which try to complement, because these two institutions plus UN is not going to be able to address all the both development and any issue, both security and other issue in each region and country. Uh, I think any initiative which is going to strengthen and making more effective the ability to address the issue both globally and regionally should be welcome, because at the end of the day, if you look at, for example, in my area, development finance, the need for financing, whether this is for infrastructure, health, education, now the digital technology, huge. And there will be no adequate resources which is coming only from one institution, even if this institution is global like World Bank or the IMF. So any other initiative who try to actually create this mechanism, mobilizing resources, creating a better governance, strengthening delivery, I think should be welcome.
All right. And going back to the domestic economy, you've long argued for that fiscal discipline was essential for restoring confidence, attract foreign investments, and improve the credit rating, notably after the Asian financial crisis. And this is something that really worked in Indonesia. So I want to ask, what kind of resistance did you face to keep this fiscal discipline that a lot of countries are struggling now to implement? And how did you address those resistances?
Well, I think the fiscal discipline, and in Indonesia cases, we adopting a very even strong discipline by not allowing deficit above 3% of GDP, or debt to GDP ratio, public debt is not larger or higher than 60% of GDP. That's almost many countries abandon that. But we also know from the history that many countries who don't have the fiscal discipline, they are going to face with difficulties. So as I said earlier, the foundation for any country to develop is actually stability, but also sustainability. This the necessary condition for the development to take place. Without that, if you don't have stability and it's not sustainable financially, the country will be in a crisis. We can see it all over the world. Whether you are advanced country, you are middle country, or even low income country, if you don't have those stability and sustainability of your macroeconomic policy or financing in this case, you will enter this crisis. And when you are in a crisis, then there will be difficult to make a progress, whether this is creating prosperity or reducing poverty. So this is necessary condition. In economists, necessary, not necessarily sufficient. So people sometimes confuse. We have the necessary condition, but if you have that, it doesn't mean that it will guarantee. You really need to do a lot of homework, like the structural reform, whether this is reform on competitiveness, whether this is reform on judicial system, labor, trade, investment, in order for you to continue growing. So what I'm saying that fiscal discipline is like necessary condition, but not sufficient. But even this necessary condition, you ask about whether this is difficulty. Of course, difficulty, because in any country, I'm saying, even the high rich country, they have huge and many objective and goal, and then always faced with the resource constraint. So this is the unpopular thing, because when you try to be a discipline, you have to make sure that this fiscal discipline is not creating obstacle for achieving the goal. While the goal is many in this case, you can be in a human capital, health, education, infrastructure, security in this case. So all those things is going to be the most challenging politically for any finance minister in the world. Try to maintain the discipline and sustainability of your fiscal, while at the same time accommodating the need of the country to continue achieving their goal. How we deal with that? I think most important is actually you have to build credibility as well as technically sound. That's why I think in this school you learn about evidence base, you learn about how technically you can prepare a policy. I think that's very important because technocracy and technically sound policy is going to be a strong platform to communicate politically across many different political spectrum. I mean, in any country, politically, you can have left, right, up, north, south, east, west. These are all, they have their aspiration. And one thing that need to have communication and discussion politically viable if you have a sound and credible political or policy design. And this is how the technocrat can help. So I did try that, and I think hopefully that was like the political trust toward how we present the budget is actually the most important achievement, and that is happened because many of political will coming from the parties.
Mhm. And now you mentioned that countries without fiscal responsibility and macroeconomic stability will likely face issues.
Mm.
That's the case of my country. I'm from Bolivia. We've recently navigated a macroeconomic crisis. Um, and at the front of the policy debates was the issue of fuel subsidy and fuel subsidy reform. Reforming, of course, these types of subsidies can be a bit politically challenging because of the impact on the cost of living. And so Bolivia has dealt with this, but of course we're not the only one. Many countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia have been dealing with the same. Indonesia hasn't been an exception. I think you've had reforms regarding fuel subsidy during the last couple of decades. So how do you navigate those tough fuel subsidy reforms, and what have you again personally done to overcome those challenges?
Well, as you said, I think the country who has the crisis because of either fiscally or financially, in this case of financial sector can be banking and so on, they usually in a situation which is very difficult. And the one that need to be fixed is the restoring confidence again, especially on the fiscal side. Now, one of many country experiencing this subsidy, which actually the objective is a very good noble goal. You try to make sure the affordability of the people toward a very important, whether this is food, whether this is fuel, energy, or even fertilizer. I mean, this is actually adopted by many countries in the world. So this good intention of policy that is helping, whether this is farmer, consumer, or industry, in order for them to be able to afford those very important commodity is usually is something which is being adopted by many countries and politically popular. The problem technically, as an economist, you know very well that if you subsidize through commodity, then the one who actually enjoy the benefit of this subsidy is the one who use this commodity most. So in the case of fuel subsidy, you try to subsidize whether electricity, cooking gas, or in this case fuel, then the one who will enjoy the subsidy because the subsidy built in within this commodity is the one who use this commodity. And of course, in the cooking gas, the richer you are, you're using cooking gas more. In fuel, in this case, the more you have car, you are going to enjoy more. And in electricity, the bigger your house with a lot of air condition and electricity, then you are enjoying more. That kind of subsidy distorted and regressive. So from the resource point of view, it's going to be better to actually make it, especially if you address the issue of equality. So the question then, removing or reducing subsidy is always politically difficult. Yeah, come from Bolivia, but you name it, many countries in the world is actually has been through this and not easy. So how you are going to be able to do that? First, of course, making sure that you have the evidence telling to the public that, hey, the government, the state presence and want to help the people. We have this money, but we are using this money through this subsidy and not those who enjoying is mostly is the one who actually the haves, while we actually want to have the have not or the poor to actually get more help, because that is the principle of equality or justice in this case. So how you are going to change? Then we say that we can change. Of course, there will be implication in terms of the increasing price that then trigger inflation. Then we want to compensate, especially for the household, which is the poorest and the most vulnerable. So we said this money that will be saved because of this is going to be allocated for the poorest. Political communication is very important. Giving the evidence is also critically very important, but also at the same time, how you are going to mobilize this kind of support. Usually in any policy, the one who get the benefit silent, the one who suffer is going to voice very strongly opposing that. So I'm not saying that this is easy. Indonesia has been through that. In my own experience, I've been done that twice. In 2005 during the oil price jump very high, and then in 2016 it was painful, and we really have to be very passionate in understanding the people feeling, and at the same time you have to be empathetic in terms of your communication, and at the same time this is not just a technocratic changing this to that, but you are seeing that you are understanding the people feeling as well as their pain, but at the same time we want to go together and try to address better. So that's very important.
But how do you communicate that? You mentioned political communication is very important.
Mm-hmm.
I see policymakers around the world turning to, for example, social media as an outlet to express these tough policy decisions. You yourself have almost 3 million followers on Instagram alone. But how do you deal with the trade-off of using social media, which has a massive reach and it's instant, but maybe you're oversimplifying these types of policies?
Yeah.
So how do you communicate
Well,
such
social
messages?
media is definitely a new platform. I mean, my experience back 2005, there were no social media, but political communication, you really have to be adapt with what is the situation as well as the instrument to communicate. But this is not like one minister alone, like Minister of Finance responsibility. So the decision, for example, like reducing the subsidy is the cabinet president leadership is very important. In my case, vice president role was very important and very quite forceful in building as well and helping the political communication. The political party leaders, they are also very critical and significant in actually giving this political support. So this is a collective work. It's not like one minister. Of course, in this case, like my own, because Ministry of Finance at that time was triggered by the concern about the sustainability of the budget. It seemed like the issue has become like a budget, but it is not. It is about the whole countries try to adopt a good and sound policy and using this foundation to make a progress better and using the resource better and equal in a much more just. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now a couple of final questions that we always ask the guests in this podcast. One is, what advice would you give to future policymakers or future finance ministers? What should they prioritize beyond just technical expertise?
Well, for any policy maker, the younger generation, you are going to face with a different dynamic environment. So if it is like in the form is going to be changed, like the communication through social media that will require you to be very crisp, savvy, and short. But at the same time, you also see the new opportunity. So I will advise all the policymakers to be adaptable to this changing environment, but at the same time, be principled. The most important principle in your life is integrity. That means you know what is right, what is wrong, and sometimes even doing the right thing is not easy. It's much easier to do the wrong things. So in that kind of particular moment, don't in this case confuse, or in this case take very short-term opportunistic, because it will backfire to your long journey, in this case when you are going to have the career in a long-term period. The second one is be technically competent, because if you are not technically competent, you cannot create this respect and credibility. People will trust because you know that you are competent, you are technically understand or have the ability to address the issue in a credible way. But with this integrity, then you are going to be able to combine these two very important assets. I think the third one is be very open-minded. I mean, the world is so fluid now, and I cannot recall your generation. You can connect with any people in the world easily now with social media. I mean, people you don't see, but you seem like intimate enough to understand, to know him or her, while you actually never actually see them. So this kind of connectivity across people can create opportunity, can create a stress and depressing situation, because then which one that I need to follow or need to be listened or to be watched. I think the selectivity, but also open-minded, is very important for your generation. Open-minded because idea can come from any corner of the world and from any source of the people, but at the same time be very selective so that you are not going to be overwhelmed with that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Just before we close, we have a question that we ask to all our guests. It's, do you have a movie or a book that you enjoyed maybe recently and that you would like to recommend to our audience here in Oxford and beyond?
Well, recently I actually watching again Good Will Hunting. It's actually about somebody who's coming from the very traumatic background, but he has a huge potential. I think that's just resonate with so many people in the world. Actually, always individually, you always went through a certain period in your life which is not necessarily good, but it should not holding back any potential that you have. And this is something which is quite, I mean, many people now, especially your generation or even the younger generation, the alpha generation, they are so exposed with this, the AI and on. So we cannot making sure that this exposure is going to be good or creating a positive thing. But whatever, while you are building your own resiliency, you have to make sure. But even if you feel something traumatic or something bad, that kind of situation should not define you for your own future. You have to be able to continue moving and making a progress, and that will require a lot of determination. So I think that's resonate well. Although that's the relatively old movie, but putting within the current context, it's actually fit well.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much,
Thank you so much.
Dr. Mulyani. This has been very inspiring. It's been an absolute pleasure. You showed us that policymaking at the highest level is about technical ability, but also about credibility, adaptability. You mentioned integrity. So thank you. You remind us that leadership matters in a world where I think global governance is more contested and more polarized than in the recent years. So thank you very much.
Well,
Thank you.
thank you so much.